Welcome to the Savvy Dentist Podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Welcome back to the Savvy Dentist Podcast, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Jesse Green here at the control panels, as always. Part of my work, in fact, most of my work, is really geared around helping dentists become true business owners, to help them make the jump from being an owner-operator to being a true business owner. And today we're going to be starting a two-part series where we discuss 13 key entrepreneurial processes or principles to help people, or help dentists specifically, make that jump from owner-operator to true business owner. Now I'm going to be joined in this quest by Dr. Nauv Kashyap, and many of you will realize and recognize that he's been on our show before, and many of you will also recognize that he's had some tremendous success in becoming an entrepreneur himself as well. So in our conversation, Nauv and I are going to be discussing what we see as the key entrepreneurial traits, the things that we've learned well on our entrepreneurial journeys, the things that we might have made a few mistakes with, and of course, some lessons that we'd like to be able to share with other people so that they don't have to make the same mistakes that we've made along the journey as well. It's a far-reaching, wide-ranging conversation where it's really frank, lots of back and forth, and we're going to share a lot of the things that have worked well, and as I said, some of the mishaps along the way as well. Now, before we do get into that conversation, I want to let everyone know about the Savvy Dentist Facebook group. It's a Facebook group where we discuss entrepreneurialism and dentistry and becoming really commercially astute as we go about building our dental practice. So for all of you listening, I'd encourage you to come along to the free Facebook group. We're going to be sharing trainings, resources, lots of tools, tips and tricks to help you on your own journey as you transition from being an owner-operator to being a true business owner. But without any further ado, here's Dr. Nauv Kashyap with part one of the entrepreneurial principles for being a great dental business owner. And today I'm delighted to be joined by our old friend Nauv Kashyap. How you going, mate?
Great, thanks. Good to be back on the show.
Mate, it's been a while, and every time we record an episode, I always think to myself, we should do that more often. I'm really pumped about what we're going to be speaking about today, which is entrepreneurial lessons for dental practice owners. Just before we get into those lessons and things you've observed and things I've observed, what's been happening in your world?
Yeah, look, it's great to be back on and recording again. So, I was actually looking forward to this. I know we've put it off a couple of times, but yeah, what's been happening? Look, the last year's probably been a lot different to the 4 or 5 years beforehand. I have taken I've removed myself completely from clinical practice. I think I've seen one wisdom tooth case in about the last 7 or 8 months. So, I finally got the courage to close my lists at every practice. So that was a great thing. And I've started focusing a lot more on more business pursuits outside of dentistry that will help me within dentistry. So, we've got our core group of practices where, I want to make changes and improve them all the time. But learning lessons outside of dentistry. Also gotten back into an old hobby of mine, which I've spoken about on the podcast before, and that's poker. So I've started traveling a lot all over the world now, playing poker. And yeah, my aim is firmly to be one of the top 10 players in Australia within the next 2 years. So working hard on that in terms of, study of the game and that kind of thing. So yeah, there's a bit going on.
And lots of good lessons from poker too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the risk side of it and the decision-making tree and stuff has been really helpful.
Cool. So, mate, tonight we're going to be talking all about entrepreneurial lessons for dental practice owners. And one of the things that I know that you observe is what's happening in other practices, not just within dentistry, but also other industries beyond dentistry as well. And same with me. That's, in fact, the whole premise of this podcast. And one of the things we spoke about before we started was that the growth of the business will never outstrip the growth of the business owner. And so for anyone listening here, Nauv and I had a conversation just before we hit record, and that was that various times both of us have been the limiting factor in the growth of our own businesses. And certainly I don't think that we're the only ones that have experienced that. But Nauv, do you have any thoughts around that before we go through these individual lessons? Have you observed that beyond you and I? Is that something you see a bit as well?
Yeah, definitely, Jesse. I mean, I've got the unique position to be able to look at a lot of other practices within our field and all around the country. And it is something that's certainly an observable trait across a lot of different practices where, just for example, a dentist that is a clinician and says to themselves that I'm not a business owner, I'm not someone who cares about the business side of dentistry, I'm just a clinician and, I own my own practice, but that's it. That's a significant limiting belief that means that their practice is not going to grow into a business. And that might be their goal, but until they get savvy and start to pay attention to that side of things, they're always going to be a roadblock. So that's probably the most obvious example.
Yeah, and look, like you, Nauv, I have seen lots of really great businesses become great because there's been someone who's been a great business owner who's taken an average business and made it great, but they wouldn't have been able to do that had they not had a certain mindset and set of beliefs and abilities as well. And equally, I've seen really profitable practices be taken over by less than great business owners, and you see the business shrink or expand to meet where the owner is up to. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon. I see it quite a bit, and obviously the purpose of this podcast is hopefully to help people grow and expand. So let's get into it, shall we?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So, ladies and gents, we have about 13 or 14 lessons from Entrepreneurial, which we felt are really relevant to dentists. And so the way this format's going to go is I'll introduce the concept. Nauv will share his thoughts around that as well, and I'll go back and forth and add my 2 cents in as well. But Nauv, I want to start with beginning with the end in mind and having a clear picture of what success looks like before you start or get too far into it. Walk me through your thoughts around that. Is that something that you started your group of practices with, knowing that you wanted to be off the tools, you wanted to have the flexibility? Was that always a goal?
Yeah, Jesse, that's an excellent one, and that's something that I firmly agree with. Myself personally, the short answer is no, definitely not. But I was lucky in that quite early on in my journey, I did adjust and did refocus and really realign my goals. To be honest, when I first got into ownership, I wasn't, it was just about learning how to run this one practice. And that was it. Stuff that I had in place was not at all conducive to being the owner of a group of practices. And some of that stuff I had to undo and then reapply on top. And it's something that I've learnt the lesson and I've realized, and I got kind of lucky in that I did it early on. But now when I speak to people, when I speak to clients, when I speak to other practice owners or guys and girls that are looking at buying a practice, and we're talking about, relevant discussion points around certain systems or things that they're going to implement in that practice that they're going to purchase, I find myself constantly looking at the end goal for them. And a lot of the time, they're not able to see why, at least initially, not able to see why that should be done that way. When, they don't understand, look, right now you might only have 2 or 3 staff members, but how are you going to do this when it gets to 7 or 8 or 10 staff members? Your practice is big enough to have 4 chairs. Is it really going to work when you get 4 chairs? And lots of simple things from the floor plan of a startup practice. People look at how they can maximize the number of chairs they get in there, which is the correct way to look at things because, those chairs produce you income. But then you're left with a floor plan that doesn't have a waiting room that can adequately cope with 4 chairs. But, they're looking at, okay, well, I really only am going to start off with 1 chair, maybe 2 chairs, and that waiting room's sufficient. They're not, it's a simple and basic stuff like that. And that's firmly, having the end goal in mind. How is this going to function when we are as big as we want to get to? But then, it gets a little bit more subtle than that. That's an obvious physical thing, but things like, okay, well, right now we've got 2 staff members on. One's a cousin of mine or a cousin's partner, and another one's this person that I know from my old practice, and I get along really well with them. We don't need staff contracts. We don't need this and that. But what's going to happen when you have 8 or 10 staff for that 4-chair practice, and all of a sudden you've got 10 people that are sources of risk that you don't know as well as your cousin's friend and your staff member that you've worked with for years? So all of that, I think, for those reasons, I think that's a really key thing. Is there any that you've observed where dentists, especially the ones starting out as business owners, perhaps forget about the bigger picture and the end goal initially?
The thing that I observe, Nauv, is most of the guys start off, and I understand this as well, but most of the guys think about, I want to have a business where ultimately I can get off the tools, but they never allow themselves the headspace or the brain space to actually get off the tools because they're so busy chasing the dollar. And I don't feel that some of the guys and girls really ever come up for air to actually look around and see what they need to do. So it's probably a little different in the sense that they might have the end goal in their mind, but their day-to-day actions don't always support that. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. But for me, when someone says, I want to be a true business owner as opposed to a clinician who owns a practice, then there needs to be a transition point where ultimately you have to take your foot off first base and make the dash to second base. You can't have your foot on first and second at the same time, in my view anyway. Otherwise, you're going to run the risk of doing the splits. So there's some things around that I kind of observe a fair bit as well, where people say, oh, look, I really just want to have the time freedom. I want to be able to get off the tools. And yet on a day-to-day basis, they're belting out clinical work after clinical work and never coming up for air. And I don't think that's really going to get them to where they want to go. But that's my observation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest manifestation of that, now that you mention it, is in a way we are a victim of our own success, in the sense that, when you're working hard clinically, you're actually earning quite a bit of money. And if your practice is busy, it's hard to think, okay, well, I should take a day off. I should take a day off to rest, recharge, work on the business instead of in the business. But when you look at it, that's $5,000 or $6,000 or $7,000 worth of billings that you're going to have to forego. And so exactly what you said, I find a lot of dentists. And the problem with that is, it happens for a year. That's fine. It happens for 2 years, 3 years. And then it just gets to a point where you start to really get burnt out. And if you'd just given up those days initially, you wouldn't have been in a position where you want to just drop the tools altogether on every single clinical day you work. So yeah, I think and I was a victim of that as well. Yeah,
look, me too, mate. And I actually hit the burnout mark, and all of a sudden, I wanted to go from 4 days to no days. So that's not how to manage it. Anyway, so that's lesson number 1. Begin with the end in mind. Have a clear picture of what it is you want to do. Understand the activities you need to undertake to get there, and start with that process firmly in mind. Lesson number 2 is managing risk and managing failure. Nauv, I know it's probably getting into your poker conversation, but understanding risk, identifying risk, managing risk, mitigating risk, and then, of course, when things do go south, being able to handle that. What's your take on those two things together?
Yeah, I think both of those are really, really important things for anyone in business, and not just in our industry. They apply obviously quite strongly in our field, but generally speaking, the ability to be able to assess and manage risk, as well as to rebound from failure, or to get the proper lessons you need from a fail, I think are hugely important. And looking at that practically, I think a lot of dentists don't look at risk in terms of a weighted average, and that's something that poker's really taught me. Okay, what is the chance of the worst case scenario here? What is the worst case scenario? Firstly, what is the chance of that worst case scenario happening? And what is the number, or what is the financial impact of that worst case risk? You look at that, you give it a weighted average, the percent times by the outcome or the loss. And then you look at the average scenario, or the scenario that's going to happen most often. What is the percent chance of that happening? And then you look at the upside scenario, and what is the best outcome? How often will the best outcome happen? And really put that together. And if you can bring it down to a number, it starts to really show you. And what I think it does doing that is it allows a lot of people to see that they can take a lot more risks than what they do. Because, a lot of the time, it's the human brain, and I see this all around me. People amplify the downside. They just really amplify it, both the chance of it happening as well as the cost of it. They see, okay, what is the worst case? And they don't properly examine, okay, if that worst case was to happen, they just think that it's going to be hugely bad. And what that then does is, because they don't examine it properly, and it may not even be anywhere near that bad, they just put it in the too hard basket. And so I think that's really important to do. What is the worst case that'll happen, and really, what is the chance that worst case is going to happen? So that's the managing risk side of things. In terms of the ability to deal with failure, I think the biggest thing that I encounter with people is people try to learn a lesson from failure even if there is no lesson to be learned at times. And I think that's huge. You know, everyone knows that, okay, we get this thrown at us like, okay, you know, you failed, but it's not a failure because you've got a lesson to learn from that failure. And so what that's done to us psychologically is made us look for lessons sometimes where there's not even a lesson to be learned. So what I mean by that, classic example is a patient coming in and deciding that they're not going to pay you. Like they knew from the outset that they were not going to make this payment. And because of that one patient, you decide to change
the whole system.
The whole system of how you take payments. And you end up offending all your happy long-term patients who start to feel like they're criminals in your practice. That's one real example that I've debated with a dentist online on the forums, you know.
I think I've seen that debate.
Yeah, you're trying to learn a lesson, but mate, sometimes things just don't go right. And, you know, it's not always that you need to learn a lesson from your failure. And the second thing is kind of like a contradictory point in that when a failure happens, if you can pinpoint what in the decision tree or what it was in the path to that failure that was the biggest factor in that failure. And, you know, sometimes, as I said, there was nothing. It just was something that was a freak thing and there's no lesson to be learned. But if there is, then it's the ability to be able to find that lesson and then not repeat it and not repeat other versions of that outcome is I think really, really good. If you've got the ability to be able to do that, then you can minimize failures a lot.
Yeah. Look, I agree. There's a couple of things I'd pick up on that as well. And I think what you've said there around being able to identify the risk and the probability and the cost of that risk occurring is critical. And the other thing that when it comes to business that we spend a lot of time on is going, okay, well, if this is the risk, what's the upside? What's the downside? Can I live with the downside? But then equally, what are the mitigating things I can put in place to try and tip the odds in my favor or reduce the cost of the worst case scenario or to, you know, enhance my degree of control of that situation. So I think with risk assessment, risk analysis, it's about clearly identifying and quantifying the risk, but then putting in place as best you can some sort of mitigation strategy as well. And coming back to the coping with failure and managing failure, I really agree with you. One of the things that someone taught me years and years ago that you've got a windscreen and you've got a rear view mirror, and really you should use them in that proportion. And you're right, when there's a mistake or a failure or something goes awry, where you're kind of drilled to go and look for the lesson. And mate, I'm all for looking for lessons or trying to take the lesson, but you're absolutely right. If there isn't one, just move on, get on with it, focus on the windscreen, not the rear view. And there's a great book and a conversation online, I think it's a Stanford University commencement speech or one of the university commencement speeches by William McRaven, the guy that did the Make Your Bed.
Yes, I remember that one, yep.
Well, in his book, he talks a lot about being a sugar cookie, which is, you know, for whatever reason when they're doing their SEAL training, life's just not fair and it doesn't always work out. They'd have to, for no apparent reason, they'd have to go run into the water in their uniform and then basically come out of the water and roll in the sand and be coated in sand all day. And for no real reason at all, everyone had to be a sugar cookie that particular day. And I think the lesson that he makes in that story is that sometimes it just doesn't turn out. And if there's not a lesson, there's not a lesson, as you say, just get on with it. So I really resonate with that, mate. Lesson number 3 for entrepreneurs and dental practice owners is about managing energy versus managing time. And this is something that I really like and think about because, you know, there's the whole school of understanding time management and making sure your appointment book is structured well, and I'm a fan of that as well. But when it comes to running a business, it does require energy, it does require effort, and therefore managing those finite resources is critical. What's your thinking around managing energy, working in biorhythms and all that sort of stuff? Now, I know a little bit about your biorhythm from what you've told me, so I'm curious to get your take on that.
Yeah, look, I guess addressing the second thing, the biorhythms and stuff, I am fairly unique in that the guys that are on the forums would know that I leave messages and I post threads and stuff quite late at night. It's been a byproduct from my uni days. I used to basically tutor every single day of uni. So I'd go to the minimum possible clinical contact that I had to during uni, skip lectures, all that kind of thing, because I was tutoring. And at that time, financially, I needed to tutor and help help with the finances and stuff, and a really strong following of students. So, it would get really busy, particularly around exam time. And so my days would be really long days. I'd tutor from like 3 when they finish school to like 8 p.m., come home, get something to eat, and then my study time would be later on that evening to catch up with the lectures and whatever I missed during the day. And so, I became a bit of a night owl, and that's carried through my whole life. I'm not someone that can get up at 6 a.m. and that kind of thing, because I'm sometimes only going to bed at 2 or 3 a.m. So I'm getting my amount of sleep that I need, but I'm waking up regularly at 11 o'clock. And people I do business with have adjusted to that as well. Don't call Nauv before 11 or 12 because he's not going to answer. And so, look, from the biorhythm side of things, that's important. Managing energy, I think the important thing of that is really prioritizing. And what it is, you can manage your energy well if you know how to prioritize well. Managing energy almost is secondary to being able to prioritize well, in that you don't have to focus on when you have energy and when you have the most firepower to complete tasks if you know what the important tasks are and you just do them first. And so I think by default, if you can prioritize yourself and find what's important in your day, or find what's important to work towards your goals or your vision, and the things that will make the most difference to that, and then complete those tasks at the times where you have the most energy, and leave the other tasks to later, perhaps when your energy levels aren't as good, then you're going to get the best outcome. Not only are you going to perform the best on the tasks that matter the most, but you're also going to, be able to get something from your low energy levels on tasks that perhaps don't matter as much. I don't know what your thoughts are around that, Jesse. It's not really a point that I'm very knowledgeable on. It's just something that's happened, I guess, by default for me.
Yeah, so look, managing energy and prioritizing, I think, go hand in hand, of course, and it's about understanding that energy is a finite resource and using it wisely, much as time is a finite resource. So I really resonate again with your point around identifying the priorities, which we're going to come back to later as well, but understanding that not everything that is urgent is important. In any given day, there's 101 different requests made of your time, people wanting this, people wanting that. And I think it's easy to be sucked into the vortex and have your priorities not stolen from you, but you've got to really guard your priorities, I think, and put some boundaries and, I suppose, filters in place so that you can use that time, use that energy for those priorities that have the biggest impact. So I really resonate with that. In terms of managing energy, I'm like you, I'm a bit of a night owl. I've perhaps adapted a little to become a little more, I suppose, conventional in the hours that I keep. Mainly school and kids and all that sort of stuff has been a shaping force there. But left to my own devices, I get a lot of my work done in the evenings. My team are used to the fact that I often leave voice messages at weird and wonderful hours. I don't at all expect them to respond to them, but I like to get that stuff out of my head while it's fresh and I can be coherent and make a thought. So I certainly, like you, work in the evenings. I get a lot of work done in the evenings. I enjoy that time. So yeah, look, for me, it's just about working with my own biorhythm and understanding the other constraints around that as well. But yeah, even in a clinical sense, I like to do certain procedures at certain times, and I like to do my productive procedures up front and early and then relax for the rest of the day. But I don't do a lot of clinical work these days either, like you. So when I was doing clinical work, it was always get the heavy lifting done in the morning and then coast through the afternoon. So that was my one. I guess from managing energy, though, Nauv, comes number 4, and that is the entrepreneurs I've observed. And the one I really kind of resonated with here when I think of an entrepreneur as Richard Branson is they really look after themselves. They take good care of their health and their well-being. Is that something you've observed in terms of protecting you as a number one asset in your business?
Yeah, Jesse, look, I mean, it's no secret that I haven't been the healthiest person going around over the last few years, and it has taken a backseat to how I have to the rest of my business. But when you look at the most successful people there are out there, Gary Vaynerchuk is a classic example of this. If you watch his early videos, his early vlogs and that kind of thing, he was quite unfit, quite unhealthy. He had quite a bit of weight on him. He was obviously still very successful, but there reached a point where he realized that, his success has got bounds if he doesn't look after himself physically. And, he joined a gym, got a personal trainer, obviously was quite well off by then, and had quite a bit of money to be able to spend and reinvest on himself. And, you look at that guy now, for his age, he's fit, he's healthy, he's got a daily gym routine, and that's someone that I admire. In the last sort of 6 to 12 months, I have been working at getting my health as a priority. And I think looking at successful people, that at some point, they all come around to the fact that is important. And the earlier you do it, the better for you from both a biological point of view, but also a psychological point of view, in that if you've got the energy, you've got the motivation, then that translates over to more success in your business, I think. So yeah, that's kind of been my observation. It's been more other people, but yeah, what are your thoughts around that specific?
Yeah, look, my observations are the same as yours, is that just about every really successful business person I've observed has come to the conclusion at some point that their health is a critical factor in their success. And they also know that if their business is going to continue to thrive, they need to be able to continue to thrive. Kind of like what we spoke about earlier, that if you're not showing up as your best, you can't really expect the business to grow and continue to do wonderful things. So part of the responsibility, and I use that word deliberately, part of the responsibility in my mind of building a business, employing other people, is to make sure we do look after ourselves so that we can be at our best to ensure the continued success of that enterprise, so that we can continue to provide employment for people, we can continue to provide services for others, whether they be patients or customers or whatever language we use around that. So I'm a big fan of making sure that we get enough sleep, exercising well, eating well, whether it's meditating, finding that quietening of the mind, or whatever it is that you need to do to take care of yourself. I'm a big fan in making sure you carve out a piece of your day for that. So whatever that is for the individual, I think that there should be some time for self in there. So yeah, I'm a fan, mate.
Definitely.
Cool. All right, so number 5 is being curious and questioning accepted norms and not necessarily believing that the status quo has to remain thus. Hit me with it, mate.
Look, I think that's a big one that I inadvertently did and found myself on early on, especially in the dental practice ownership circles. Looking at myself, I got into my first practice at, I think it was 2008, so I would have been 24. 1 year post-graduation, before I hit 30, I think I'd already started about 8 to 10 practices, and comparing myself and my age with other practice owners, there was definitely a big gap in age. And part of that gap in age, part of what came is my ideas and my vision were perhaps a lot different to what was accepted in the industry as normal. I was talking about things 5 or 6 years ago that were really frowned upon. External marketing things. We were talking about how dentist wages were going to drastically change. This was a time where 40% was the norm. And I said, look, this won't be the norm in coming years. We were talking about, for example, I had someone on the owners group that made a comment regarding hiring graduate dentists recently. And, that same person and I had a really extensive argument. And there was quite a few people that had a really extensive argument, just 3 years ago, on how they would never hire a graduate dentist because of this reason and this reason and this reason. And that same person was all about hiring graduates now. And it going back a few years, it really, looking at that conversation and the way that the industry was treating graduates, we went from a time where there was people that owned practices that never had an associate, so they would all just close down, to having the opportunity to hire more experienced dentists. And then, with this influx of grads coming, I knew there'd be a time where experienced dentists would then become a little bit more difficult to find. And if you look at some of the metropolitan areas, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, dentists with 5 to 7 years of experience are getting tougher to find again now that we've closed the overseas pathway. And so we built out a graduate strategy very, very early on. So I wasn't at the whim of the labour market and the dental labour market. We developed grads. I've had, I think, 3 or 4 graduates now that have gone on to become an owner in my practices or a partner in the practices, and we hired them from either 1 year out or just a fresh new graduate and developed them and that kind of thing. So look, I think challenging the norms, challenging what's accepted in every industry is where the true entrepreneurs sort of grow from. And that's not giving myself a pat on the back or anything, but it's more about, if you look at yourself, look at the way that your business is done, are you just doing what everyone else is doing? And are you really looking to do things differently, or are you just happy to continue with the status quo? And I think the point that you've brought up is a very, very important one.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Nav, because this is something I feel really strongly about as well. Whereas most people deal with evolution rather than revolution, and it's often incremental change after incremental change. And when we sold our first practice, it was in 2008, and this was really before the GFC seriously hit. In fact, it hadn't hit at all. We were quite fortunate in that regard. But one of the things that I observed even back then was that the business model for most practice management at that time was fundamentally flawed, because it taught people how to be employees in their own business, really. It didn't at all teach anything to do with business ownership and how to create leverage and how to create a scalable enterprise. And so that's something that I felt very strongly about. And when you talked about that at the time, you were frowned upon. And I remember we moved to Brisbane, and at that point I decided that I didn't want to own a practice for a while, because I started a different business, started an online marketing agency for dentists. And I remember at the time, the people who I was dealing with, they'd say, "Oh, you're an entrepreneur," and it was like a dirty word. If you were called an entrepreneur, it was in dental circles, it meant that you were shadowy, you didn't care about the patient, you're only in it for the money. And I remember at the time, I remember watching a film some years ago. I can't remember the title of it, but in essence, they said when someone throws an entrepreneur, when someone throws a slight or an insult at you, embrace that word and own it. And I remember standing tall and going, you know what, absolutely, I think I am an entrepreneur, and that's a good thing, because an entrepreneur creates value, they're adaptable, they're nimble, all those sorts of things. And I remember they just kind of stared at me as though I had kind of horns on my head and something was wrong. And even when I was running the digital marketing agency, they all wanted new patients, but no one would want to call themselves an entrepreneur. So I remember even back then, this is in 2008, suggesting Google AdWords, which was really new. And it was like I told them to sell their soul. Oh no, we could never possibly do that. Yeah, it's phenomenal. But these days it's all commonplace. And I remember embracing the word, being a dentalpreneur, and writing articles about that. That word's obviously since been appropriated by others, and that's fine. But being an entrepreneur is, I think, important. And I guess at the time it was controversial, but I was saying to people, there are changes coming. No longer can you be content to be just a good dentist and hope that the books are going to be full and you'll be able to rely on supply and demand. You're going to need to have some business acumen. And at the time, that was a controversial thing to say, and people shouted me down for it. But I think these days most people would say that being a good dentist is great, but need to have some business skills as well. Anyway, so again, not to pat myself on the back or to make comments of that nature, but I think going against the norm is a good thing, and I think it's about looking into the future a little bit as well and trying to see those things coming before they do. And I think that's what entrepreneurs do, is they kind of read the tea leaves a little bit and can see change happening.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
So, mate, in terms of delegation, and I know you and I have had lots of conversations about delegation, tell me a bit about your take on delegation when it comes to running your business. I know it's been a factor in your success. I'm curious to understand how big a factor it's been in your success and get your thoughts on how to do it, when to do it, who to do it, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, look, Jesse, I think delegation, my wife and my mother, actually, the two of them gang up and give me so much crap about the fact that I delegate every single thing in my life.
I get that too.
And my close friends have, sort of jumped on that as well. And they're like, if you could delegate someone to brush your teeth, Nauv, you would literally do that. So, delegation for me is something that I have done early on. And I think the big reason for that is simply that once I realized where I was heading, and like I said, there was a lag time, but once I realized where I was heading, I basically realized very quickly that to get to where I want to get, there was parts of my business that I wouldn't actively be able to do on I'm talking on a hands-on basis day to day. It kind of started from there. For delegation to come second nature to you, you need to be comfortable that it may not get done, especially initially, as well as you are going to do it, and you've got to be okay with that to begin with, and that's where the guys that are, or the girls that are control freaks are like that, because fundamentally they're not comfortable with that, right? And again, it's about assessing the very first point, assessing the downside risk. Let's say if they don't do it as well as you do, let's just say that they can't do it as well as you do. What is the worst that can happen, right? And when you examine that out and build that out, you realize it's really not that bad. Because, okay, let's say they do a bad job. You can step in again. You can retrain the person. You can, do all of that very quickly. And so once you realize that and understand that fundamentally, then I think it allows you to be able to let go of more things. And I think I've been lucky in that delegation has never been the issue. If anything, I've sometimes been a victim of over delegation in some things, but overall, there is no way I could have gotten to where I've gotten in terms of the size of my practices, in terms of the number of practices, and in terms of just my businesses generally and the time I have available to pursue new ventures. There is no way I could have had any of that if I didn't trust in some really key staff. And I think the big thing around delegation is to surround yourself with people that are trustworthy and who value integrity and honesty as much as you do. I recently had a conversation with a practice manager of mine who she was on maternity leave for, I forget, I think it was about 7 or 8 months. And during her maternity leave, this girl was putting out fires for my practices, was constantly dealing with staff issues for me to the point where I would just not even have to deal with them, and this person did all of that. And, at the end of that, I was aware that she was doing that, and I probably wasn't aware of the depth of the problem she was solving, but the breadth definitely, I could see how much she was doing. And at the end of that, I just said, look, just have another week off maternity leave, fully paid, and as a thank you for all that you've done, and then that's not the point of the story. The point of the story was then she's obviously come back and she does a lot of stuff from home that she does after hours. And I've said to her, look, you need to write down those extra hours in the book and you've got to make sure that you're paid for it. And I don't look at the books. I don't look at the wages. I don't look at how it's done. Someone takes care of that stuff for me. And, about 3 months after I made that statement, I find out that she's not writing any of the hours she's doing it at work. And I thought, okay, what's going on here? So we had a chat about it just a couple of days ago. And the big thing was, she said to me, look, Nauv, I just feel bad writing hours in because, some weeks it's this and some weeks it's that. And I just don't want to feel like I'm ripping you off. So it's just easier if we just count what I do when I actually come into the practices. And, that's obviously not on for me. Like, we had a discussion around that. But my point is there, it is much easier to delegate if you're delegating to people who have integrity and who you trust and who are loyal. That's not to say there shouldn't be checks in place, but part of the reason that people don't delegate, well, the first part I've already discussed is because they don't feel like it can be done as well as they can do it. But the second part is simply that they don't trust people. We hear about all the bad stories of all the practice managers that rip people off and this and that. And what again, people don't realize is you don't hear about the good stories. People aren't going to get on there and talk about how they've had this practice manager for 15 years and they've been so great. They're going to talk about the practice manager they've had for 5 years that has started stealing off them, and so people automatically assign that to be a much greater outcome than what it is. And so I think those two things are fundamentally important. And this is coming from the point of view of someone who might find it difficult to delegate. If you can address those two issues, then hopefully delegation will be a lot easier for you. But in terms of the actual process of delegating, Jesse, I think you might be a little bit more qualified to give some ideas around that. What are your thoughts?
Well, the first thing for me, mate, is that delegation is not abdication. And I think that one of the reasons delegation, in inverted commas, sometimes falls over is because we don't properly equip those people who we're delegating to. We don't provide the necessary training, the necessary resources, and so on and so forth. So we kind of say, hey, Mary or Bob or whoever, could you please go and do X, Y, Z? And of course, there's no training, there's no equipping, there's no resources. So one of the simplest ways to delegate is this training and equipping process where, I'll do it, then I'll do it while you look over my shoulder, then you do it while I look over your shoulder, then you do it, and of course you teach it. But in that process, developing training systems, standard operating procedures, if that's appropriate, and so on and so forth. So that's my first comment around that. But one of the things that we often talk about is not enough time equals not enough team. And so for me, I'm a bit like you, mate. I'm a pretty good delegator. I like to think I get a lot of things off my plate, and there's probably still some work I can do in that. But still, I think that I've learned to become a better delegator as I've gotten older. And I think the key for me is to understand what are the highest value tasks that only I can do. What are the things that add value to the business that are uniquely within my skill set? And so for those other tasks, we either look to delegate them, which we've spoken about, automate them, or eliminate them altogether. And so we end up periodically, well, at least twice a year, every 6 months, ending up with a list of Jesse needs to do more of this, less of this, and stop doing this altogether. So I get a list of do more, do less, and stop. And ultimately, for me, that just means that I'm constantly honing my focus and sharpening my intention around what are the things that I can do uniquely that add value to the business, and then trying to get rid of the rest of the stuff. So equally, there's that whole, I think at the Depop conference last year, I spoke about this as well, is that there's a lovely little phrase and 3 letters, the HOW, is how. And how do I do this? How do I do that? And one of the shifts that we've had is rather than using those 3 letters to form the word how, we use those same 3 letters to form the word who. Who can do this? Who is the best person on my team to do this? And so I think going from how to who has been a fundamental shift for us. And really, rather than asking the how question as a default, which I used to do, it now becomes who can help me with this? Who can do this? Who can take this off my plate? And that's been a key thing for us, mate.
Yeah, I think those are the way that you've articulated the process of how you delegate in terms of every quarter, or was it every 6 months? You get these lists of tasks. I think that's something that everyone that's in business should really take heed of, because the way that you've articulated how you've gone about delegating and the process you use to be able to move yourself out of tasks that are not important for you to be doing, I think people should really listen to that and take that on.
Thanks, mate. So let's go to our next point, which is about habits. Do you have, I'm assuming good habits is what we're going to talk about, but what habits do you see as being fundamental to your success? And in fact, do you think that you've had any particular habits that have been key to your success? And if so, what would they be? Habits
is one that it's for me, I haven't had strong habits, just being completely honest. The things that I have had, that I have done habitually, I guess, has been just that desire to, if I take on a task or if I take on a project, to try to, and it might sound so cliche, but try to do the very best that I can with that particular project, So that's had 2 major outcomes. Number one, I no longer take on projects where I can't do a better job than what's already out there. Not going to go and start to, a classic example is I run seminars on how to start your own practice or how to buy your own practice and what's involved, what's important, all of this sort of stuff. And those seminars are hugely successful, really well attended. And given they've only been running for 3 years, I would consider them to be, the leading seminars like that in the marketplace. But I regularly get asked at those seminars and external to those seminars is, okay, well, now Nauv, you've helped me start a practice, or I've bought a practice. Now I need help with the systems in the practice. What can you do? What services do you offer? How much is it going to cost, and all the rest of that? And it's straight away like, look, Jesse Green has been the person that's helped me with that stuff. Go and talk to Jesse, and I've, out of habit, only take on tasks that I know I can really excel in. And that the downside of that is, yes, I don't really expand and I don't really go and grow, but there's plenty of work in the areas that I look at. And one of the other things is, if you look at practices, for example, what I'm good at is startups in fringe suburban areas. So what I'm not good at is central CBD practices. I mean, I know how to market those practices. I've had enough marketing experience to help owners in that regard, but I'm not going to go and start a practice in the middle of a CBD. And so habitually, one of the big things is I know my strengths. I also know my weaknesses. And instead of trying to work on my weaknesses, that, there's plenty of gurus out there that'll tell you got to work on your weakness, you got to improve that. I don't. I really just maximize what I'm good at. So I think that's been a key habit of mine. But in terms of the daily habits, I was listening to a podcast by some successful person, and that in that podcast they outlined their daily habits and their daily routine. You know, one thing that I do is I plan my day in my head the night before. That's probably a bit of a habit, but you know, you've got guys that wake up at 6 a.m., they go for their 30-minute jog, they then come home, they have a breakfast of this, and then they sit down, they meditate, and then they do this and they do this, and they've got this 2-hour routine before they even start their day. You know, I'm not one of those person, and I know people have had huge success from building habits like that, but that's not me. The only habit that I have is as soon as I wake up, I'm straight in the shower and then I brush my teeth. That's those two things I do. The first thing that I do, you know, and that might seem odd, but breakfast is not a meal that I usually have. You know, it's
well, not at midday, mate. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So, look, in terms of habits, Jesse, I guess that's probably been the main habit. But yeah, what about yourself? I know your days, just in conversation with you when we're setting up things like recording this podcast and just having a phone meeting or whatever it is, your day seems a lot more structured than mine would be, I think.
Yeah, look, I think I'm probably quite a structured person in that regard, and I, like you though, I've heard all the guys that have their 2-hour morning routine, and I can honestly say, no, I've given that a red hot go. I have persevered trying to get up early, go to the gym, come back, have my bulletproof coffee, drink my quinoa smoothie, and all that sort of stuff. I'm probably being a bit facetious as I say that, but I've tried really hard to give that a go. But what I've found is, for me, is that I just am not that kind of person either. I have structure in my day, but in Canberra, I can tell you, we're recording this in April, we're coming into winter, and I can tell you by the time July rolls around, there is no way known you're getting me out of bed 6 o'clock in the morning to go running, go exercise, because it's just too cold, it's miserable. So for me, I'm also thinking, well, how do I create some of those routines in my life? So the routine that I do stick to is, yes, I have structure in my day. Yes, I batch activities. So which is probably not a habit, but I'm keen to batch activities. So I'm using my time well. The habit that I have that I do routinely get up and do though is, like you, the first thing I do is I get up and I have a shower. The next thing I do is I get up out of my shower and I'll have a cup of coffee in the morning. That's something I do. And I'll often just sit for 10 minutes and think about my day. And that's a little different to planning it the night before, but I like to have a little bit of quiet time just to gather myself and get organised. And the other habit I have, which is going to sound very self-serving, but when I'm driving the kids to school, after I've dropped the kids to school, I will either listen to a podcast or a cassette or a CD or whatever it is, some sort of audio program. And then the other habit that I've got is probably 2 or 3 times a week, I'll not go into the office, I'll duck off to a cafe and I'll spend a good hour just thinking, planning and doing that. So that's really, I don't know that that's really particularly insightful for the listeners here, but yeah, as I said, I've tried really hard to do the whole 2-hour morning routine. I just can't do it.
I think we're alike in that regard.
It's not for the want of trying though, mate. I read it and thought, I'll do that. And then I said, nah, can't manage it. To thine own self be true.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green. For more free tools and resources, join the free Facebook group. Visit drjessegreen.com/Facebook. And for more episodes, visit drjessegreen.com/savvydentist.